What's going on, guys? It's Greg here, aka NYPrepper. I just wanted to make this quick video about the importance of seating your primers deep in your primer pockets. So I'm loading up some 300 Remington Ultra Mag and some 300 Win Mag. I'm just doing some fine tuning of some loads that I worked up recently. And one thing that's just really important is when you're seating your primers, most manuals will tell you that it's fine to seat your primer flush or slightly below flush. Well, if you seat your primers flush or barely below flush, you may have situations where your primer's not going to go off. So if you look closely at my primer here, you can see it's pretty deep in the primer pocket. Okay, you can see it's probably about 20 thousandths below flush. Now, if you're going to be doing this, you want to make sure that you wear safety glasses in case you accidentally detonate your primer. See, look at that. You see how deep that primer is? It's a good bit below flush, and you can just rub your finger and feel if it's deep or not. If it's deep, you'll clearly feel that the primer is deep. If it's just barely below flush, like a couple thousandths below flush, you're going to feel that it's below flush, but you're not going to feel that depth, and I've been doing it this way a long time, so I can just feel it out. They have different tools you can buy to measure your primer seating depth, but I don't go that crazy. But you have to seat that primer as deep as it can go. And the reason why is you can have misfires or you can have no fire at all. And so what will happen is if you don't seat your primer deep enough in the primer pocket, when the firing pin hits the primer is going to actually shift a little bit forward in the primer pocket, and that's going to absorb some of that energy from the firing pin, and it's not going to pierce the primer and detonate it, okay? So you want to have that primer as deep as it can go so it's sitting against that primer pocket tightly, so it's completely against the inside of that primer pocket, so it's as far as it can go. Because if there's even just a couple thousandths of wiggle room for that primer, sometimes when that firing pin will hit the primer, that primer will just slip forward in the primer pocket just a little bit and it won't detonate, especially if you're using harder cup primers like CCI primers, which is what I use exclusively because they're much better in cold weather. So if you're using CCI primers especially, you have to seat those primers really deep. I've had situations where I didn't get the primer to detonate several times, and I seated the primer just barely below flush, which is normally okay in most situations, but because those CCI primers are a lot harder, they didn't go off, okay? So now I seat my primers really deep, so just make sure you wear your safety glasses in case you accidentally detonate one. But if you're using a CCI primer, they're not very easy to detonate. So you can really put a lot of torque on your press when you're seating your primer. I use a single stage press, and so I seat my primers on the press, and you can really put a lot of torque and it's not going to detonate because that cup is so thick. But if you're using a thinner primer like a Federal 215 or something like that, you may want to be a little more careful. But what I do is I basically seat the primer initially until I feel like I hit a wall, and then I'll check with my finger and see how deep I got it, and then usually it'll be like around flush or just barely below flush. And then what I'll do is I'll put the case back in and I'll just give it like one more solid push with the lever, okay? One more solid torque. And then that usually seats the primer to as far as it can go. So it's critical, especially if you're reloading for self-defense or hunting ammo or dangerous game loads. You want to make sure that those primers detonate. You don't want to be in a situation where you have a bear charging you and you're using some hand loads, or you have a bad guy that broke into your house, or he's trying to attack you on the street or something, carjack you, whatever, and you squeeze that trigger and you just hear click and nothing happens, so you want to seat those primers as deep as they can go. Don't be afraid to torque on your press to really seat those primers deep, especially with the CCI primers. So that's pretty much it for this one, guys. Check out my reloading playlist for all of my reloading content. Stay tuned for more reloading content. Take care. God bless. And don't forget the 3 Ps. Prepare, practice, and persevere.